All right, so today we're gonna dive into something that might make you look at your phone a little differently. We're talking about texting. You know, something most of us do without even thinking about it. But what if I told you that simple act of sending a "be right there" or a "what's for dinner" text could be putting you right in the middle of a massive Chinese hacking operation?
I know it sounds kind of crazy, but we've been looking into some sources that suggest this is exactly what's been happening. There's been a major hacking campaign targeting telecom companies, and the FBI is even recommending we all switch to encrypted messaging apps because of it.
It's it's about time someone sounded the alarm. This isn't just some random data breach. We're talking about a highly sophisticated and persistent hacking operation that Microsoft has dubbed Salt Typhoon. And the sources we've seen indicate it's the most persistent campaign the US has ever seen from this particular group. The scary thing is it's been running silently in the background potentially for years. So we're not just talking about someone snooping on our grocery lists here. Our sources point to the potential for intercepting phone calls, text messages, even accessing sensitive call metadata.
And it's not just everyday folks who might be affected.
In fact, the sources we're looking at today specifically mention that Senator Chuck Schumer's office might have been targeted, along with both the Trump and Harris presidential campaigns.
Imagine that. Late night campaign strategy sessions suddenly feeling a lot less private.
Definitely not the kind of transparency you'd want in those situations.
And here's the thing, most people don't even realize what call metadata is or why hackers would be so interested in it.
Right, like what exactly are we talking about here?
It's basically information about your calls, but not the actual content. So think who you called, when you called, how long you talked. All of that creates a surprisingly detailed picture of your life and your connections, even without knowing what you actually said.
It's kind of like a digital fingerprint.
Exactly. And what's even more concerning is that most people who've been affected by this hack probably don't even know it.
Because they haven't been told.
And that raises some serious questions about data privacy and transparency from these telecom companies.
Okay, so we've got potential access to calls, text messages, and this treasure trove of metadata. And then the FBI and SUSE come out and basically say, hey, everyone, even everyday folks could be at risk.
It's a wake-up call for sure.
They're not just talking about politicians or high-profile targets. It's potentially every single person who uses their phone to communicate.
And that brings us to the really significant part, their recommendation to start using encrypted messaging apps like Signal and WhatsApp.
Which is interesting because you'd think they'd want to be able to easily access that information for investigations.
Exactly. It really underscores how seriously they're taking this threat. It's almost like they're saying, look, we know your privacy is important, but so is your safety. And right now, encryption is the best way to ensure both.
It's almost like saying, we believe your messages are safe, but with a wink and a nod that says, but not really. It makes you wonder what else is going on behind the scenes. But let's shift gears a bit here. We've been talking about the software side of things, but what about the actual physical infrastructure that all of this relies on?
You're hitting on a crucial point because this hack specifically targeted what's known as legacy infrastructure. And that's not just software.
Right, we're talking about physical stuff.
Exactly. Think cell towers, the lines themselves, all those physical components that make up our communication networks.
And those are vulnerable.
Surprisingly so.
Okay.
We tend to focus on the digital world, but these physical systems are just as susceptible to attacks, if not more so.
It's kind of like having a high-tech security system on your house, but leaving the back door wide open.
A perfect analogy, and it highlights a critical aspect of this whole situation. The vulnerability isn't just digital, it's physical too, and that makes it much harder to address.
So we know that things are maybe not as secure as we thought, but let's get practical here. When the FBI suggests using encrypted apps, what are we actually talking about? I think most people have like a general idea of what encryption is, but what's really going on behind the scenes?
Yeah, it's one of those terms that gets thrown around a lot, but understanding how it actually works is crucial. Basically, encryption is all about scrambling information so that only someone with the right key can unscramble it and read it.
Okay, so it's like turning your message into a secret code.
Exactly, like a secret code that only the intended recipient can decipher.
So how does that play out in like a texting app?
Let's say you're using an encrypted messaging app like Signal. When you send a message, your phone uses a sophisticated algorithm to transform that message into what essentially looks like gibberish.
Gibberish.
Yeah, it's just a jumbled mess of characters that would be impossible to understand without the key. That gibberish gets sent to the recipient, and their phone, which has the matching decryption key, unscrambles it back into readable text.
So it's kind of like sending a locked box through the mail. Only the person with the key can open it and see what's inside.
That's a great analogy. And here's where it gets really interesting with end-to-end encryption. Even the company that runs the messaging app can't read your messages.
They can't.
Nope, they don't have the key. Only you and the person you're communicating with do.
So using an app like Signal or WhatsApp is like adding an extra layer of protection on top of my regular texting.
It's like putting your message in a super secure envelope that only the intended recipient can open.
And like we discussed earlier, this is especially important when you're texting between different types of phones, like iPhone to Android, where those messages aren't automatically encrypted.
Right, because in those cases, the messages are often sent as plain text, which means they could be intercepted along the way.
Got it.
Yeah.
So if encrypted messaging is like Fort Knox for my texts, what about other forms of communication like email? Is that just as secure?
Email's a bit different.
Hmm.
While you can encrypt email, it's not as widely used or as user-friendly as encrypted messaging apps.
So it's possible, but not as easy or common.
Right. Part of the challenge is that it often requires both the sender and recipient to have compatible encryption software and settings.
So it's not as seamless as just using an app designed for secure messaging?
Exactly. And that's why for most people, encrypted messaging apps are the way to go if you're really concerned about privacy and security.
It sounds like it. And even if you're thinking, well, I've got nothing to hide, it's still worth considering your digital privacy.
Absolutely. Everyone has information they wouldn't want falling into the wrong hands.
Whether it's financial details, personal conversations, or even just our location data.
Exactly. It's about having control over your own information and who has access to it.
And with all the data breaches and cyber attacks happening these days, taking steps to protect your privacy is more important than ever.
It's no longer something we can afford to ignore.
You're right. It's something we all need to be thinking about. And this whole conversation has got me wondering. We've been talking about protecting ourselves from hackers and government surveillance, but what about the companies that hold all this data in the first place? What responsibility do they have?
That's a great question. And honestly, I think we need to start demanding more accountability from these tech giants. They have so much power, and they collect vast amounts of data on us, often without our explicit consent or even our awareness.
And they're not always transparent about how that data is being used or who has access to it.
Right. It's like we've sleepwalked into this situation where we become so reliant on these technologies without really stopping to think about the potential consequences.
And this Salt Typhoon incident is a wake-up call.
It's a stark reminder that our digital lives are vulnerable and that we need to be more proactive about protecting our privacy and security.
Absolutely. So where do we go from here? What can we actually do to make a difference?
Well, for starters, we need to start demanding more transparency and accountability from these companies. We need to know what information they're collecting, how they're using it, and who they're sharing it with.
We need to shift the power dynamic back in our favor.
Exactly. And on an individual level, there are things you can do to protect yourself. Use strong, unique passwords for all your online accounts. Enable two-factor authentication wherever possible. Be cautious about what information you share online, especially on social media.
And, of course, use those encrypted messaging apps for sensitive communications.
It's all about being mindful and making informed choices.
It's not about being paranoid or disconnecting from technology altogether. It's about understanding the risks and taking reasonable steps to mitigate them.
Exactly. It's about being empowered digital citizens and demanding better from the companies that hold so much power over our digital lives.
So we've covered a lot of ground here talking about secure texting.
Yeah, from the technical details of encryption to the bigger picture of privacy and security in this digital world.
And I think it's safe to say that this whole Salt Typhoon thing has been a kind of a wake-up call. You know, it's easy to just go about our day sending texts without really thinking about it, assuming everything is safe and sound.
But the reality is our digital lives are more vulnerable than we realize. And this incident really highlights how important it is to take steps to protect our privacy.
For sure. So let's bring it all home. If you're listening to this, you're probably thinking, okay, what does this all mean for me? What can I actually do about it?
Right. It's easy to get lost in the details, but we all want to know how to keep our information safe.
Exactly. So let's break it down.
Okay, here's the bottom line. Think about how you text and who you text. If you're having a conversation about something sensitive, something you wouldn't shout from the rooftops, consider using an encrypted messaging app.
Like Signal or WhatsApp.
Exactly. Especially if you're texting someone with a different type of phone, since those standard messages aren't automatically encrypted.
Right, iPhone to Android and all that.
Exactly. But beyond specific apps, there are some basic things you can do to boost your security overall. like strong, unique passwords for every single online account. That's non-negotiable.
Yeah, it seems like common sense, but you'd be surprised how many people still use the same password for everything.
It's like using the same key for every lock in your house.
That would be crazy.
Exactly.
God.
And whenever possible, enable two-factor authentication. It's that extra layer of security where you have to confirm your identity through a separate device like your phone.
So even if someone gets your password, they still can't get in without that second step.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And be mindful of what information you share online, especially on social media. You'd be surprised how easily seemingly harmless pieces of information can be used to build a detailed profile of you.
It's kind of creepy when you think about it.
It is. And I know some people might be thinking, well, I'm not doing anything wrong, so I don't need to worry about all
But
this.
it's not about having something to hide, is it?
Not at all. It's about control. Control over your own information, your privacy, and making sure your data isn't being used in ways you haven't agreed to.
And this Salt Typhoon hack really drives that point home. If something as basic as texting can be compromised, it makes you wonder, what else are we taking for granted? What other everyday technologies are we using that might not be as secure as we think?
That's the question I want you to think about. Take a moment to consider the technologies you rely on every day. Your phone, your computer, your smart home devices. How much do you really know about how they work and what data they're collecting? And what steps can you take to be more proactive about protecting your privacy in this constantly evolving digital world?
It's a lot to think about, but it's important. Because at the end of the day, our digital lives are an extension of ourselves. And protecting our data is about protecting our autonomy, our privacy, and ultimately our freedom.
Well said. It's time to move beyond simply being users of technology and become informed, empowered digital citizens.